Okay, before we look at the cross-referencing question for your homework over the holidays, just want to remind you about the school history website. Here it is, brauntonhistory.blogspot.com or .co.uk. Doesn't really matter. If you go on it, you will find lots of these little videos with me talking about all sorts of stuff, lots of stuff on Germany. Okay, there's previous papers. There's this paper from January 2013. There's all those question and answer sheets you've been doing in class. And if you're unsure what to look for or where to look, down the side here you can find different tags that I've given things, meta tags. You can also, of course, search along the top, alright, along here as well, to find what you want. You probably won't want this one. Okay, but today we're going to look at cross-referencing question. Right, so the question then, 10 marks. Study sources A, B and C and use your own knowledge. How far do sources A and B support the view of source C about the first day of the Somme? Explain your answer using the sources. When it says use the sources, it also means use your own knowledge, right? You must use your own knowledge in any question that isn't the first question. Now, this is slightly different to the other cross-referencing question you've done because the view it's asking you to judge the sources against is actually in source C. So the first thing we need to do is look at source C. So let's have a look at it. So let's look at the origin. This is from the Diary of a British Soldier on the 1st of July. Now, if you remember anything about the Battle of the Somme, you will remember that it started on the 1st of July. So that's going to be important. This person is talking about the 1st of July, the very first day, and from your own knowledge you should know that the British had huge casualties, 20,000 casualties on the very first day, most of that within the first sort of half an hour to an hour in the morning. And this person says this: it was a bloody disaster. Very clear right away what this person thinks, isn't it? It was a bloody disaster. As soon as the signal was given, machine gun fire opened up on us. The heaviest casualties occurred on passing through the gaps in our own wire, where the men were mown down in heaps. There were dead and wounded everywhere. Now, if I were you, in the actual exam, first thing I'd do, if you got a question saying, look, what's the view of source C, how far do the others agree with it, I'd make it very clear, make a note what that view is. And the view is that it was a bloody disaster. Alright, it's quite obvious. So let's look at the other couple of sources and see if they agree with this or not. Shrink this down. Source A then, from Sir Douglas Haig, the guy who was actually in charge. So Douglas Haig says then, oh, notice again, on the first day of the Somme. Alright, on the first day. He says, yes, we had some casualties. Overall, however, and it's the however which is important. Also, for literacy purposes, notice how there are little commas here. Right, very important. Overall, however, a very successful attack this morning. All went like clockwork. The battle is going well for us, and already the Germans are surrendering freely. The enemy is so short of men that he is collecting them from all parts of the line. Our troops are in wonderful spirits and full of confidence. Right, now, let's, apart from working out whether he's right or wrong there, let's just compare these two. Let's compare this line here. Our troops are in wonderful spirits and full of confidence. And here is one of the troops. It was a bloody disaster. And the question is, how far do they support the view? Well, source A doesn't, does it? It doesn't support the view about the first day of the Somme. Haig says that all went like clockwork. He said it was very successful. Now, it may well have been very successful. We'll look at the background in a second, according to his own plans, but you can't really say that the troops thought that because, well, they didn't, or at least this one man didn't anyway, and that's what we have to consider. Right, so let's look at the middle source then. Get rid of these. Source B. A photograph of wounded British troops, 1st of July 1916. So they're all from the same time. Now let's have a detailed look at this then. Look at the casualties. Well, first of all, there are casualties, aren't they? They're not dead. They are casualties. Let's look specific details here. We have people with various injuries. Don't look too serious though. I mean, this guy here, obviously not doing too well, but he's able to sit up. He's able to have some soup, as this guy's got here, some coffee. Got this chap here smoking a cigarette. They seem to be in reasonably good spirits. Oh, hang on a second. The soldier's diary we just saw didn't suggest this at all, did it? I mean, it didn't say that people didn't have food and drink afterwards, but it said it was a disaster. This doesn't seem to agree with that at all. Or does it? Because the question, remember, is how far? How far? Let's just have another look at source C a second. Put that up there. There's one down here. Now, are they talking about the same thing? Well, there were dead and wounded everywhere. So he's talking about the battle. Source C is talking about the battle. Source B, however, is not talking about the battle. You have to make an inference. And, well, from this, you wouldn't think that there were any dead. You might work out that maybe some had died, but it doesn't make it explicit, does it? It doesn't show any dead. It just shows wounded. Now, he says there were wounded everywhere, so I suppose that detail there does agree with this. They sort of agree in some points then, but not everywhere. Let's just have another look at Douglas Haig's. Does he mention anything about people being wounded? No, he doesn't. Well, he said we had some casualties. Some casualties. Now, that's an interesting little detail. Some casualties. But he does say our troops were in wonderful spirits and full of confidence. Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say they're jumping for joy, are they? But, I mean, if we look at this little guy here, seems to be smiling. This guy, yeah. Oh, this guy looks a bit like Dylan Hall there. Yeah, he's smiling. So, there are some similarities, definitely. They're not all saying the same thing, though. So I suppose you've got to try and get that across by looking at those details. Right. Let's have a look at some background information. Now, you already should know some of this, but I'm going to use a great site here, johndclare.net, which you may well have come across before. So on johndclare.net, if you type this in your address bar, you'll get this information. Let's have a look then. So, artillery bombardment. So the attack then... The attack was preceded by an 8-day artillery bombardment in which 1,537 British guns fired, God dear, nearly 2 million rounds, and the sound was so loud it could be heard in England. And the idea was to kill the Germans, but also to destroy the barbed wire. Now, this clearly didn't happen, did it? Because 7:30 a.m, as everyone runs out, despite all this bombardment, 20,000 dead and more than 35,000 wounded, probably more than any army on any war on a single day. Now that seems to go against what Mr. Haig is saying. It seems to agree with source C, doesn't it? So if you're using your own knowledge here, you probably would want to point out that actually the evidence, the historical evidence, supports source C. It doesn't really support source A, although perhaps it supports source B a little bit. Let's keep looking then. By August, questions were beginning to be asked. Lloyd George lost confidence in Haig. At home there was grief and horror. A propaganda film designed to encourage support for the war by showing the public what the men were going through was well received by many people as a glimpse of what our soldiers are doing in daring and suffering in Picardy. That's in France. 18th of November then. As winter set in, here we are, did the battle begin to grind to a halt. The place they were meant to capture, Bapaume, had not been captured. Only 6 miles of ground had been taken. The final casualties were British 415,000, French nearly 200, Germans around 600. Some sources say 650 to 700. And Lloyd George calls the Battle of the Somme the most gigantic, tenacious, grim, futile and bloody fight ever waged in the history of war. Right. So the history seems to agree with source C, doesn't it? There are certainly suggestions that source B is right. Douglas Haig, he says we had some casualties. Overall, however, a very successful attack. Well, now this is the interesting point, isn't it? Because the idea is to capture this place Bapaume. The idea is to completely smash through the German line, but that doesn't happen. But he doesn't know that, July the 1st, 1916. So you can only go then on the 1st of July. The history supports source C. How far do these agree with source C? Well, I would suggest that there are some parts of here which agree that there are wounded everywhere. But overall, the tone of source B is much more pleasant, it's much more positive, isn't it? Does source B completely agree with source A? Well, there are some suggestions, yes. Our troops from wonderful spirits are full of confidence. Well, maybe not wonderful spirits, but once again, little Dylan here seems to be alright. What you've got to do then is pick out details from source A and source B which agree or disagree with source C. Next then, we've got to look at the origin. Well, Douglas Haig, he's in charge. He would say that the battle went really well, wouldn't he? Although one would hope, being the guy in charge, that he would learn from mistakes, which eventually he does, but not by the 1st of July. Source B, we've talked before about war artists and war poets. They are going to take photos of the terrible death, but at the same time, they're probably not going to be out in the battlefield, aren't they? Because they're going to get shot. So they may not see the worst of the death until after the battle in November. And source C, well, it's a British soldier. One would expect from the history that lots of soldiers felt like this. Although, would they have been able to see the whole of the battle? No, because they're only going to be in one place at one time. Actually, General Haig should have a more objective view, but the fact that it's his plan means that it's probably more subjective. What's the purpose then of each one of Copru? Well, this is a report, so this is going to be read by politicians back at home. This is a documentary photograph. It's supposed to document what happened. As we said, if we could go into the battlefield, but they would, but not on the 1st of July, certainly not. You're not going to go running out there. And this is a diary. Diaries are supposed to be where you put what you think personally, that perhaps you don't expect to get out. So perhaps a place to vent. That's why he's used the phrase bloody disaster. Reliability then, well, that goes back to how subjective you think each of these are. A documentary photograph is supposed to be objective, of course, but because it can only take one snapshot of one place at a time, it can only tell one part of the story. This is not supposed to be objective at all. This is entirely subjective. And source A, even though it's supposed to be objective, once again, it's Haig's plan, isn't it? So, overall then, how far do sources A and B support the view of source C? Alright, Copru is the way to think about this, always, for every question on this paper. Source C is what you're basing everything on, but you have to also use your own knowledge as well. Pick out details from source A and source B that agree and disagree with source A. Use your own knowledge. You must use your own knowledge. You have to. It's imperative. And come to a conclusion. The conclusion should be how far, not just whether they do or not, that's obvious. How far, how much, okay, to what extent. And if you're stuck for words, think back to Vietnam. We had that scale of words 0 to 10 to say, oh, completely, totally, a little bit, slightly. Use some of them. You might even want to jot them down somewhere. Use some of those words to help you come up with a sort of scale of to what extent. How much does something agree?